Hello. Today we'll be looking at Exposure by Wilfred Owen, part of the Power and Conflict cluster, examining language, form, structure, and considering how this poem could also link to power and conflict. So we begin by looking at the word exposure itself. What does it imply? What does it suggest? What are the connotations of that word? You could start by writing down a few ideas on that. Initially, I'd suggest looking at the image, which could also give you a clue what's happening to that tree in terms of the lightning. So an idea could be that it is vulnerable. It is open to attack. Could be an idea for the word exposure. I'm interested to find out what you guys might think. So you can pause this, have a little think, and write down a few of your own ideas on that word, which might give you an indication on what the poem itself might be about. Right, so in terms of learning outcomes for this week, we'd like you to be able to describe how Owen uses personification in his poem, explain what feelings Owen gets across to his readers and how, and to be able to evaluate how Owen uses a refrain within his poem and how it impacts his readers in terms of looking at it structurally. So, as we usually begin with some background context about these poems, we'll start off today by looking at this poem is basically a war poem. Some of you in year 9 might be aware of Wilfred Owen. You might have done Dulcet Decorum Est in year 9, war poetry earlier this year. A little background information for you. So when war was declared in 1914, the British Army wasn't large enough to fulfill the large demand of sending young men overseas. And so ordinary men were encouraged to do their duty and enlist. They were encouraged by propaganda and a sense of patriotism. Looking at some of the posters at the time, you can see some of the images that were kind of used to engage more young people. That was obviously before there was a conscription in 1916, and men were forced to join up. But before they were forced, they were largely kind of encouraged and persuaded through these types of posters. A large amount didn't necessarily need that much cajoling and persuasion, because at the time, the general idea about war was that it was quite exciting, quite a honorable thing to do for your country. Some people regarded it much like a sport. So culturally, it was deemed a manly thing to do, to go out and fight for your country and, if necessary, die for your country. And that was a patriotic idea promoted by propaganda, promoted by culture, basically. So one of these men who joined was Wilfred Owen, and he became known as one of the greatest war poets. You can see an image of him. I think he joined up pretty young when he was about 22, and he became an officer. He joined the military in 1915, officer by 1916, went to war as a young officer, and he suffered a great deal of mental trauma. And he was sent back to England, suffering from shell shock, heavy bombardments, bombs going off around him. That can cause a lot of mental trauma in people. And Wilfred Owen was one of those who was sent home to recover and be treated in the hospital. Because he had the first-hand knowledge of what was happening, many of his poems were written to show the truth about war and the suffering of the men. He wanted people to understand the reality of war. People might have thought this war was kind of a sport. It'd be over by the end of the year, they thought. Go off and do something brave for your country and let your name be known forever, inscribed on walls. And it's quite a heroic thing to imagine. But I think Wilfred Owen just really wanted people to be aware of the other side of the truth, the ugly side of war. And often people thought he was just complaining. It's quite interesting, though, that he returned to war despite all his quote unquote complaints, which weren't really complaints, but just a revelation. He returned to war in 1918, even though he could have stayed at home on home duty because of his previous injuries. Given the choice, he went back. And by October of that year, he was awarded the Military Cross for bravery when he captured an enemy machine gun and used it on the enemy. So it contrasts what we kind of think about writing and writers. Here we have a writer who is actually living what he writes. So unfortunately, he was killed in action in November, just a month later, and the month before the war actually ended. So in his poems, he looks at how the conditions of war were as lethal as the enemy, and not just the condition, but also the idea of war as being somewhat pointless in itself. So despite all of this, why would Owen go back when he could have avoided this? Why return to a war that you think is somewhat pointless and obviously quite lethal? Now, you may consider some different options. You might think about these things. You could write down a few ideas. Think about the camaraderie. Think about maybe forming bonds with your fellow soldiers. Maybe these are some of the reasons why a young man may return. Possibly, he wanted to reveal more. Maybe he viewed himself as perhaps the voice of these soldiers. As a voice, could he really stay at home and ignore these aspects of war? Something for you to consider. Written here is a letter that he wrote home. It's quite an interesting read. At the top of that slide, there's a website that shows you the many drafts that he did for this poem that you're about to read. But I suppose if we just have a read of the last paragraph, you can have an idea of what's coming up in this poem. I suppose I can endure cold and fatigue and the face-to-face death as well as another. But extra for me, there is the universal pervasion of ugliness, hideous landscapes, vile noises, foul language, even from one's own mouth, for all are devil-ridden. Everything is unnatural, broken, blasted, the distortion of the dead, whose unburiable bodies sit outside the dugouts all day, all night, the most execrable sights on earth. In poetry, we call them the most glorious, but to sit with them all day, all night, and a week later to come back and find them still sitting there in motionless groups, that is what saps the soldierly spirit. So that last paragraph is quite significant because it tells you of the dead, being face to face with the dead, your fellow soldiers, who probably weren't given proper burials, maybe not having the time, resources, being able to see them day after day, night after night, and possibly a week later. Now that really tells us of the hideousness of war. And as he says, they're sapping the soldierly spirit in quotations marks. So that soldierly spirit is what he determines as what people think soldiers have, this brave kind of macho kind of attitude to war, showing you actually this is what you're faced with. And in essence, this is what takes away that glorious side of war. So it's quite an interesting idea for you to think about in terms of Owen's own views and perhaps how that connects to his writing. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start looking at the poem now. I'll read a stanza at a time, and then I'll kind of analyze aspects of it. You might be able to find other aspects. You know, a poem is so kind of multi-layered that you might find one idea has various interpretations by different people. So this is what I'm about to do is basically give you kind of a starter, so you can start thinking of your own ideas, perhaps. Okay, so I'll begin reading. Our brains ache in the merciless iced east wind that knife us. Wearied, we keep awake because the night is silent. Low drooping flares confuse our memory of the salient. Worried by silence, sentries whisper, curious, nervous, but nothing happens. Right, so from the very first line, it's quite a dramatic idea there. Our brains ache in the merciless east winds that knife us. So essentially, we have a sense of trauma in terms of brains aching, but not just the trauma. It's not a trauma caused by bombs or actual enemy attack. This is an attack from nature itself. So the merciless east winds, the winds are brutal, harsh. The idea of knifing suggests that the cold is piercing them. It's penetrating clothes, skin. So it's quite a brutal imagery of war there. This personification, and not of war in the ordinary sense, but in the sense of being exposed to the elements. The soldiers keep awake because the night is silent. It's interesting that they'd be wearied and worried because the night is silent, but it just tells you of the idea of these soldiers being on edge. Low drooping flares confuse our memory of the salient. There is a sense of confusion among the soldiers as well. So they're tired, but they're also afraid of this, confusing their memory of the salient. So they can't remember what is important anymore. You know, they're worried by silence. Interesting that you'd be worried by silence, but it's almost that idea of being on edge because this isn't supposed to happen. It's almost like walking into a trap. You're waiting for something to happen, and they're worried by that. Sentries whisper, curious, nervous, this idea of repetition of these emotions of being on edge. But then we have the last half line there, but nothing happens. So despite all of this being on edge, there's nothing happening to kind of relieve that tension. And that I find is even worse than anything else. All right, so next stanza. Watching, we hear the mad gusts tugging on the wire, like twitching agonies of men among its brambles. Northward incessantly the flickering gunnery rumbles, far off like a dull rumor of some other war. What are we doing here? So starting off this next stanza again with another personification, the mad gusts of wind tugging on the wire, like twitching agonies of men among its brambles. So essentially the wind is giving this image of a soldier who's trapped on the barbed wire, you know, the image of barbed wire that surrounds these trenches, and the mad gusts, so giving the nature this kind of emotion of being mad. It's mad. It was merciless before. So nature is quite a brutal character in this poem. And obviously, given the imagery, this simile of agonies of men among its brambles. So we get this idea of men trapped like brambles on like these thorns trying to escape. It's like this twitching agony. It's a lot of pain. The flickering gunnery rumbles. So in the distance, they can hear these sounds of the guns. They can see the flickers of lights from the ammunition and the bullets, but they are far off. like the dull rumor of some other war. So we get this image here of, it's a biblical analogy. I think it was Matthew chapter 24, verse 6, where Jesus said, "You will hear of wars and rumors of wars." So he was kind of prophesying the end of days. And in the end of days, he said you'd hear about rumors of wars. So essentially, Owen alludes to this idea of there's an end coming, but it's far off, like a dull rumor of some other war. So it does remind us of this impending doom, but still it's nowhere near in sight. There's no definite end. Jesus didn't, in the Bible, didn't give them a definite answer to when the end of days was. He just said, there's going to be a few things, and one of them will be the rumors of wars. So this is kind of an indication to that. There's no kind of definite end to this. It's going to keep on happening until it ends. And then the question follows is, what are we doing here? So this question adds to the futility of the situation. You know, if these things are so far off, if they're just being exposed to these different elements, what is the point really? What are we doing here? And another half line there to kind of support this idea of pointlessness. There's no kind of completion to the buildup of the previous lines. The poignant misery of dawn begins to grow. We only know war lasts, rain soaks and clouds sag storming. Dawn massing in the east, her melancholy army, attacks once more in ranks on shivering ranks of grey, but nothing happens. So the poignant misery of dawn begins to grow. So dawn being personified again in terms of being regretful, being miserable. So the waking morning itself is a misery to these men. They only know that war lasts, rain soaks, and clouds sag storming. So the only thing they know for sure is the environment, the nature. Nature is horrible. The rain, the clouds, the miserable morning. Dawn is described as having an army, and it's a melancholy army. So it's a very deeply sad army. So there's quite a lot of imagery of sadness, semantic fields of depression, melancholy, misery, poignant. All these adding to this idea of this kind of futility and the horrid, ugly side of war. So attacks one more in ranks on shivering ranks of grey. So it's a grey sky, and this grey sky is described as an army itself. So we get the idea of it being cold, gloomy, and grey. And this idea of nature as having its own army is quite symbolic of the men being attacked not just by the Germans, but by nature itself. And in all of this, again, nothing happens. So this refrain we're going to look at later on, but nothing happens, is we're going to think about why that's important and how that kind of adds to this idea of this war being an unfruitful enterprise. Sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence, less deadly than the air that shudders black with snow, with sidelong flowing flakes that flock, pause, and renew. We watch them wandering up and down the wind's nonchalance, but nothing happens. So as you can see there, each stanza begins with quite a dramatic start of something being attacked or something happening. But then later on, nothing happens. It's quite interesting. We start with sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence. You can obviously hear that repetition of the S sound there, this sibilance, and think about what it represents. There could be a few interpretations. One could be the idea of the sound of these bullets zinging through the air. by using that alliteration, it brings that out. Or could consider the ominous S sound, which we know links to the snake. So this idea of the environment and everything around them as being quite evil. But those sounds are less deadly than the air that shudders black with snow. So the atmosphere is more deadly than these far-off bullets that zing through the air. It's quite interesting that what we'd expect isn't what we actually get. This is something that is being revealed by Owen. For many people wouldn't have realized that back in those times, and even today. So the air itself is shuddering. So the atmosphere is shuddering. It's a fearful environment, black with snow. Now, snow is obviously supposed to be white. Here we get the idea that it's black, which suggests that it is possibly now ash. It's no longer snow, but it's ash from fallout, from bombs, etc., which obviously brings in a negative connotation and a contrast. With sidelong flowing flakes that flock. Now, this is another interesting alliteration. Whereas S might be a bit more ominous, the flowing flakes that flock could be a bit more calming and kind of, well, peaceful in a sense. Pause and renew. We watch them wandering up and down the wind's nonchalance. So flowing flakes that flock links to the idea of nonchalance, being kind of calm and relaxed. It's almost like the atmosphere doesn't really care about these men. It's continuing its onslaught with a sense of nonchalance, not caring, being quite casual about it. And then nothing happens again. So we have the beginning of the stanza with this quite impacting sentence and statement. Few more details in the rest of the stanza that kind of add to this tension, but then there's not a release of this tension. Nothing is happening. Pale flakes with lingering stealth come feeling our faces. We cringe in holes, back on forgotten dreams, and stare, snow-dazed, deep in grassier ditches. So we drowse, sun-dozed, littered with blossoms, trickling where the blackbird fusses. Is it that we are dying? So again, another impacting start. And this time, it's quite disturbing imagery of these pale flakes with lingering stealth come feeling our faces. So you imagine now the flakes that were falling, black with snow, or even now there might be a different type of flake. It might be a bit paler, but now these flakes are feeling their faces. So imagine the imagery. Instead of saying dropping on their faces, we have now an idea of the environment. What do you call it? Like interrupting the men's comfort zone, like coming right into their faces and actually touching them. It's quite a creepy imagery. Lingering stealth to come and feel their faces, which kind of suggests it's a kind of an intrusion. We cringe in holes, back on forgotten dreams, and stare, snow-dazed. Now, the idea of them cringing in holes, it's almost dehumanizing. It's an image of them like animals. We can imagine like a rabbit or a scared animal or a cold animal cowering and cringing in a hole. This is the imagery we get of the men back on forgotten dreams and stare, snow-dazed. Now, their dreams are forgotten. Who is it forgotten by? Is it forgotten by them, forgotten by the readers, the people back home? An interesting thing to think about. They're snow-dazed, obviously being confused, possibly seeing the snow, looking at white snow all this time. They're confused by that, but confused also by their surroundings, becoming dazed and confused and disoriented. But they're thinking about deep into grassier ditches. So I'm interpreting that to mean that they're thinking more about home and where they're coming from. They're back on forgotten dreams. Could be not that they're turned their backs on them, but are they going back to forgotten dreams? Are they finally had some time to think about what they wanted to be before the war started? Footballers, cricketers, teachers, doctors, lawyers. What did they want to achieve before they were subjected to this? So we drowse, sun dozed, littered with blossoms trickling where the blackbird fusses. So they're drowsing now. They're going to kind of a half sleep, half reality, sun dozed. The idea that obviously this is a bit more pleasant instead of snow dazed. We have them sun dozed. It's a bit more warm, a bit more possibly thinking about more cozy things, grassy ditches, blossoms trickling where the blackbird fusses. But there's still some confusion in this stanza, and this is why I think it ends with this half line, is it that we are dying? It links to the idea of the men not knowing what actually is happening to them, you know. But another interpretation could be that it kind of links to this question, the other question, what are we doing here? That interrupts, but nothing happens. So what are we doing here? Is it that we're dying? So these questions, it could be answered, is it that we're dying could be answering the first questions, what are we doing here? Are they there dying? Are they dying now? Is it that what they're supposed to be doing? So this stanza kind of reflects this confusion that's going on in their minds at this point. Slowly your ghosts drag home, glimpsing the sunk fires, glows with crusted dark red jewels. Crickets jingle here, there. For hours the innocent mice rejoice, the house is theirs, shutters and doors all closed. On us the doors are closed. We turn back to our dying. This continues a kind of a dazed idea of where they're thinking more about home now. They're in a, some could say, an hallucinatory state. They're thinking more about home. They're seeing things. Slowly your ghosts drag home. Ghosts in terms of, which it could be ambiguous. It could be their minds. Are they thinking they're home? But it could be also that people are starting to find out more about them back home. Is it that the media is starting to pick up on certain things? Is it that people like Owen and other writers are starting to expose the reality, making the people back home aware of these ghosts? The interpretation we could go with right now is the idea that their memories are going home, their thoughts are going home, ghosts of themselves. They are glimpsing the sunk fires, glows with crusted dark red jewels. So they're thinking the fires that are back home, that are unlit now or dying because they're not there to light these fires. The interesting imagery here is that they're glows, that they're covered up, these fires, with crusted dark red jewels. An image here, I think, of the blood that is crystallized and solidified in the snow. So it's almost like they're seeing things, glimpses of home mixed in with what's happening around them. Crickets jingle there. So it's so quiet back home that the crickets are loud. For hours the innocent mice rejoice, the house is theirs. Again, emptiness back home. There's nothing there. Everything is overrun again by nature. Crickets take over, the mice take over. Shutters and doors all closed. On us, the doors are closed. we turn back to our dying. So interesting here that the idea then is that it almost feels like there's no return, there's no going back. The idea of not being able to return back to our dying. So they're being shut out. The idea, their feelings is that they can't return home. So they go back to their dying, which is what they're doing now while they're cringing in a hole somewhere. They're thinking about death and they turn back to it. This is kind of like coming to terms with the idea of your impending death, which is a sad thought, really. Since we believe not otherwise can kind fires burn, nor ever sun smile true on child or field or fruit. For God's invincible spring or love is made afraid. Therefore, not loath, we lie out here. Therefore, we're born, for love of God seems dying. This stanza is quite a religious stanza. We've had one kind of biblical allusion before with the rumors of war. And I think this one kind of is a bit more straightforward in terms of its religious connotations and aspects, despite it being somewhat ambiguous and not as clear, really. But let's go through it. So this stanza is essentially why they're going back to their dying and why they're accepting their fate, because they believe that kind fires will not burn if they don't do it. So we believe that not otherwise can kind fires burn. So kind fires meaning peace, prosperity. Think of the imagery of the sun. The sun will not smile on the child and fruit and field if they don't make this sacrifice. So the sun won't shine in England, meaning happiness and prosperity, England and the world, if they don't sacrifice themselves. For God's invincible spring or love is made afraid. So God's spring here, meaning God's idea of prosperity and peace and love, is made afraid. So they're God-fearing. So for God's love and for God's invincible spring, their love is made afraid. So their love is linked to being afraid, in a sense. So you hear that term, you're a God-fearing man or a God-fearing woman, a God-fearing person. It means you not necessarily fear God, but that you understand that if to be accepted into paradise, you have to follow God's rules. So it's a sense of love and fear. You fear being sent to hell, I guess. So you obviously follow the rules. And this is just a religious aspect of this poet. You may choose to agree or disagree with this point, but it seems that the idea that they were born for love of God seems dying. So the idea then is that Owen is saying that the love of God seems to be about dying. In the Bible, Jesus died because he loved God and because he wanted to obviously protect people from sin and hell. Many people throughout history have died for their gods. So the one interpretation could be that these men are fighting to sacrifice because of God and peace and religion and obviously these wholesome things. And they view it as, he's viewing it at this point as being about dying. Loving God is about sacrificing, which, you know, to us might seem a bit unjustified and unfair, but this is what he's reading it to be. So these things seem to be about sacrifice, and sacrifice is, I think, the center of this stanza. Another interpretation could be that the love of God seems dying at this point. It seems like God doesn't love them. Are they losing faith? Is the speaker in this poem losing faith in God because he's not having any help? An interesting point. Therefore, we loathe, not lie out here. Not loathe. We lie out here. So they don't hate God and what's happening to them. They lie out there to just accept it because this is what it's kind of a acceptance of what this life is all about. He seems to be sacrificing himself for good, for goodness sake. If you don't believe in the idea of a God per se, you're dying for good. Tonight his frost will fasten on this mud and us. So his being God, shriveling many hands and puckering foreheads crisp. The burying party, picks and shovels in their shaking grasp. Pause over half-known faces. All their eyes are ice, but nothing happens. All right, so speaking about God again and his frost, so God's nature will fasten on this mud and us. Just the idea of these men will be frozen over. Some bodies won't wake from the cold night. Shriveling many hands and puckering foreheads crisp. This idea of them being frozen and shriveled up. The burying party, people who go around burying these bodies, who pick up these bodies and they're in charge of burying, in their shaking grasp. So these men are shaking. Is it they're shaking from the cold or shaking from the trauma of seeing their friends, their comrades in the ice? They pause over half-known faces. Half-known suggests that their faces have been distorted by the snow and the ice, the puckering of their foreheads and the shriveling of their skins. All their eyes are ice. So, whose eyes are ice? Another ambiguous statement here. Could it be the burying party? Could it be the bodies? And could it be all of them? All their eyes are ice. The metaphor there suggests this idea of them being frozen over and cold. It could also suggest that they're not necessarily dead, but everyone is numb from this situation. But again, nothing happens. So despite all this, they're there for seemingly no reason at all. Okay, so we've spoken a lot about a few things concerning the lines, the stanzas, the language being used. We could spend a little bit of time speaking about the structure of the poem and how that adds to this sense of pointlessness and desperation and pain and suffering for these men. So you have a look. So the stanzas, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 8 stanzas of 5 lines each. It's quite repetitive in terms of that structure. So it's quite an ordered and it's quite a long poem. And we could discuss how that kind of links into the idea of this situation going on and on and on and being dragged out for these soldiers in the cold. If you notice some of the stanzas, the lines, the end lines are quite punctuated. Most noticeably the first stanza with these ellipses, obviously linking to this idea again of the extent of being exposed in this situation. You'll notice also each stanza ends with a half line. So as I discussed before, consider the fact that things are carrying on, and there's in situation like this, there's supposed to be a kind of a continued order of things, but the half lines here indicate that things are not as ordered as they might seem. It gets cut off, half lines suggesting things are not really ordered, a sense of incompletion. A soldier is sent to fight a war, and when that war is fought, sadly, either they die or they happily return home. But that is a completed cycle, isn't it? We suggest here that these half lines suggest that these men never get their completed cycle, the mission, things that they've been training for months. They've geared up their psychological minds and feelings, readied themselves for battle, and many of them, as you see here, don't get that cycle completed. So it's quite an interesting idea of using these half lines to present this unsettling idea of not completing something. Yes. We could look at also the refrains, repeated half lines, but nothing happens. These repeated half lines kind of obviously indicate the repetition of what they're doing as well, and the futility of it, the kind of pointlessness of it. You know, nothing's happening. Nothing keeps happening. In terms of rhyme scheme, let's look at the rhyme scheme quickly. You can see here, I don't know if you can see the arrow, us, silent, salient, nervous. So A, B, because silent doesn't rhyme with us. Salient rhymes with silent, so we have another B. And then nervous rhymes with knifus. So A, B, B, A. This rhymes with nothing, so it's a C. And that continues throughout the poem, giving us this almost ordered rhyme scheme here, A, B, B, A. And then obviously a C comes in again and spoils the whole kind of scheme, so to speak, which obviously again links into this idea of an incomplete setup. If this line had rhymed with A or B, again, it might have had some sense of completion to it. But again, we have this idea of this disjointed, unsettling aspect of the poem. It stays the same here, which kind of links into the idea of throughout of being kind of stuck and stagnated, but also as this discomfort by not completing the rhyme. The idea that this poem also adds to this dis-ease, I'd like to say, not a disease, but an idea of discomfort and disorder, is that the rhymes themselves aren't complete rhymes. They're called para rhymes because they're almost half rhyming. If you look at knife us and nervous, we have the us sound, but obviously everything else from the rhyme isn't complete. Ner doesn't rhyme with nigh. So we have nivus and nervous. Similarly to silent and salient. We have the ent sound, but we don't have the alient and the I. That doesn't necessarily rhyme. So silent, salient, nivus, nervous. Obviously that doesn't rhyme. We have wire, brambles, rumbles. So and am, the R and the ire don't rhyme. But obviously we have the same kind of similar endings. So wire and war, brambles and rumbles. So this para-rhyming is continued throughout the poem, which again adds to this idea of this unsettling, incomplete rhyme. So the idea that it continues and there's this kind of stagnant rhyme scheme of A, B, B, A, and C, but the idea that the rhyme isn't really complete adds to this idea of it being uncomfortable rhyme, so to speak. It's not a full rhyme that we kind of feel relaxed with, in a sense. So it's quite an interesting poem in terms of getting across these ideas in terms of techniques and structure. Okay, so a few activities for you guys to do after my lengthy discussion. Hopefully you've paused at some aspects so you can get ideas and then start doing the tasks. Firstly, personification is used throughout, and I've probably highlighted a few of them too. You can start by looking at how Owen has used personification in the past in his other poems. What do all these personifications have in common? Why do you think Owen used personification to describe the war zone? And what other techniques do you think a writer can use to help in war poetry, and why? So it's a short response to this one, just to get you into the idea of thinking about personification. Attempt this task. Right, so hopefully you've paused on the last task. So we're going to look at this one now in a bit more detail. Going back through the poem, I'd like you to highlight or copy out as many examples of personification as you can. You're going to explain why he's used personification in his poem. I'd like you to explain 4 aspects of personification and what does each help us to see or understand. So find as many examples of personification as you can in the poem, highlight them, write them down maybe, if you don't, if you're not using a PowerPoint or Word document, which might be easier. But then I'd like you to also explain for them. So here we have some examples. In the merciless east winds that knive us, low drooping flares, now ever sun smile thrown child or field or fruit. And there are quite a few more that you could get. What you could do, well, what I'd like you to do is just write down what a few of these actually suggest. So I'll begin with the merciless east winds, just to give you an example. We have the word merciless, which suggests that the wind is brutally cold. Oh, spelling. And harsh. Also, it is piercing, because I'm taking that from the word knife. Piercing and sharp, and I'd say actually painful. So that is what that personification suggests to me. You might have other interpretations. You might have found these quotations. You might have others that you'd like to write about. Spend some time doing that. Obviously, pause just to, and probably replay if you want to go back through that again. But just think about what the image creates in your mind, what it suggests to you, what does it make you see, what does it make you feel, or what does it make you understand? Okay, next, I'd like you to find quotations that show how the soldiers feel during these experiences. Highlight or copy out each one of those quotations, and for at least 4, explain how the soldiers feel and why. And as a challenge for you in the green, explain why the poet presented the feelings of the soldiers this way. I'll show you an example in the next slide, and then you can attempt that by pausing this video. All right, we have a few here. have a look at them. The one that I always go back to is we cringe in holes. It's such a strong image. I can't but resist. I can't resist talking about it. So we cringe in holes, to me, suggests obviously fear, desperation. Obviously, cringing is, trying to protect yourself. What's happening with this? In an almost animalistic and instinctual way. From death. And I think when you think of that idea of an animal or anybody cringing in a hole, it suggests that human or any animal need for shelter, trying to protect and preservation of life. So to me, that feeling is definitely of fear and desperation. And on a literal level, you could also discuss it being fatally cold. Not cold that they have to do that. So yeah, consider writing down your own views on some of these quotations, and there are more that I'd like you to find. Obviously, I've just pinpointed a few examples for you earlier. There are quite a bit more. Okay, structurally, we're just going to talk about the refrain, the section of the poem that is being repeated. Hint the half lines that I spoke about earlier. Some of the half lines are repeated. Highlight them or write them down, and discuss why Owen has chosen this refrain. I won't go through an example of that with you, but that is quite straightforward. You should be able to find that refrain quite easily and just write down your own views on why he's chosen that and how does it help to emphasize his message to his readers. What message do you suppose Owen is trying to send? And how does the refrain of what the refrain is you're going to find helps that message? Okay, we're going to do a practice question. How does Owen present the realities of life in the trenches? Now, for a question like this, it's quite easy to just start writing and perhaps not knowing where you're going to end up. But what I'd suggest is, if you had a question like this in an exam, you'd start to think about what realities are actually presented and what realities have been exposed to you. There might be quite a few, there might be more than one. And therefore, you need to spend some time thinking about what these realities are. And those would inform your topics, sentences, and your points for your paragraphs. So firstly, consider what realities have been exposed. For me, the idea of fear has been exposed. The reality of life in the trenches is one of fear. The reality is the vulnerability as they're exposed to the elements. And another one is the idea of dis-ease, discomfort, being always tense. You might have a few more. You might have different thoughts on those realities of life in the trenches. You can consider them as well and write down a few of them. Be interesting to see your views on that. But more particularly, one of those will become a paragraph that you'll be discussing in the next slide. I'll show you the next slide as an example of one I prepared earlier. Okay. Right, so my topic sentence was looking at the fearful life and how Owen presented them as frightened animals. So my point, the poet illustrates the reality of the soldier's fearful life by presenting them as animals. My evidence was Owen uses the phrase, "we cringe in holes," to remind the reader of how a small, scared animal might behave when it is under threat and how it would seek shelter underground in a burrow. Analysis, Owen reminds the reader that the soldiers are just ordinary men and that the power of nature can reduce brave soldiers to frightened creatures. It infers that they're as vulnerable as defenseless animals being preyed on by a vicious predator. In this case, that predator is the harsh weather conditions. Now, contextually, as a soldier endured these devastating conditions, Owen reveals what soldiers really faced was undignified, horrific, and far from honorable, as depicted in the propaganda of the era. The reader is made to understand the other side, feel the same sense of fear. I got that wrong there. Understand, to feel, I'd say. That's why it's good to read over your work, kids. The reader is made to feel the same sense of fear conjured by this realistic and accurate portrayal of unfortunate soldiers lingering between terror and powerlessness. So that is my kind of further explanation, evaluation, and the effect, I'd more likely say, the effect. So point, evidence, analyze, some context, and effect. Now, this is here to help you as a kind of a platform from which you can spring into a variety of different what you call structural analysis and structure of your own analysis. Teachers use these kind of acronyms to kind of give students an awareness of what needs to be analyzed and what needs to be kind of developed in each paragraph. Obviously, feel free to experiment with different ways of putting things around, moving this up here, moving that down there, doing your own analysis in different ways, maybe using more than one quotation in a paragraph, as long as they're not too long. But in terms of answering the question, in this paragraph, I've highlighted the point of how reality of life is presented. I've used a quotation. I've analyzed that quotation. I've looked at context. What I could have done here is perhaps speak about a technique that's being used. We cringe in holes is kind of a imagery, possibly a metaphor describing these men like they're animals. I could speak about the dehumanizing effect of this technique. But yes, what I'd like you to do is write a paragraph of how Owen presents the realities of life in the trenches, looking at this example. Take a pause if you need to listen back to anything and write your own paragraph. Have a look at this again, the slide before that, in terms of what possible realities you might think have been exposed. Pick one of those realities, or two if you want to write 2 paragraphs, and discuss them, backing it up with quotation, technique, and explanation, and the effect on the reader. Okay. All right, so to end the lesson, after you've written your lovely paragraph on how Owen presents the realities of life in the trenches, I'd like you to think about how power and conflict is shown in the poem, which is something we perhaps didn't look at in my paragraph to a great extent. Let me look back at that. I think I briefly mentioned it in terms of the powerlessness of the soldiers. Obviously, that could be developed on in terms of the real power here is given to nature. Nature is much more powerful than man in this poem. So that's something you could think about. Who has the power? How is it shown? What conflict is present? Internal conflict, character conflicts, feelings, external conflict, man between nature. Is it internal? Man versus his feelings about God. There are a few aspects you can consider in terms of themes. Content. Explain the context and the situation, explain what takes place in this poem, explain why it was written. And structure. How does the poet build tension? What techniques are used and why? Just 3 short paragraphs, just detailing to me your ideas on these 3 aspects of the poem to show your understanding. Okay, and until next time, be safe.